Hello, this is my third installment on my series on birth rates and debunking quite a few ideas that have been commonly accepted. And today I want to talk about the biggest misunderstanding in overpopulation discussions and population discussions in general that I have uncovered that was the primary reason why I started investigating this subject. And I started my investigation around 2021, and I've been working on a book for that time. And this question really, really got to me, and it shifted my whole perspective when I started to dig into it. And that is about female education and its influence on birth rates. What people have been saying is that the answer to overpopulation is to educate women. Now, there are so many problems with this simplification. Obviously, I'm female, I'm educated, I believe strongly in the education of women. Absolutely, there's no question. However, simplifying birth rates into a cause and effect connection with this idea is incorrect. The fact is, and this is what I noticed in the people around me, is that a lot of women with a lot of education have more children than some of the women with less education. So, what the commonly accepted idea is about this, the idea that educated women have less children, is simply not true. So this all comes from the misapplication of a correlation with a cause and effect situation. Now, since we study statistics and demographics and even in other areas of science, this is a really, really, really common problem to mistake a correlation with a cause and effect. We have many correlations in life, things that seem to happen together and seem like they are connected, but often they're not directly connected, they're indirectly connected. So what's happened in the past is they looked at all of the countries of the world and they looked at basic education like high school. They asked the question, how many people in this country have finished high school? Or for some, that question was just, have they even been to high school? And they measure how many people have been to high school or finished high school. And that is the measure with the comparison to the birth rates. So you put that on a chart and you'll see that a lot of the lowest education countries have a very high birth rate, and a lot of the highest educated countries have a very low birth rate in general. I can show you what that chart looks like. So this is the kind of thing that would make you think, okay, this is a direct and obvious correlation. Down here we have 0 to 20% of the female population that has some secondary education, 20 to 40 all the way up to 80 to 100. This is female education, and this height here is the crude birth rate of those countries on average. So all the countries in each of these groups averaged shows the highest birth rates here and the lowest birth rates here at the highest level of education. This kind of shows you why this idea has stuck around, why people believe this to be true. When you divide it into 20, it does look like, yes, this correlation is quite obvious. So these set of statistics are the ones that I'm going to go over a few more times in a few more graphs. So I'm not really sure who decided to only look at female education and decide that that was the most important thing. Now, I have looked in detail at a lot of different statistics now, and it's true that education is one of the strongest close correlations with birth rate. That is true. And it is true, like I said, that for the most part, when you look at the lower levels of education, that in fact, yes, the countries with more educated women have less children. But, and there's a big but, there's a lot of other things going on. And not only are there a lot of other things going on, but those things that are going on more now than they were 30 years ago when they started touting this idea as though it was fact. So the truth is that when you include higher levels of education, master's degrees, PhDs, you start to see a reversal of that trend. So I'm going to show you a bunch of the different charts that I've seen, graphs from different countries. You can see clearly that it makes a big difference what kind of education you're looking at. And when you're looking at human behavior, you're hardly ever going to see a straight line. Nature does not work in straight lines, and neither does human behavior. You're going to see J curves, U curves, S curves. Basically, you're going to see waves. That's how most human behavior will end up looking on a graph, because that's how we function. We are an organism. Again, we're biology. We're not a machine. We don't behave like a machine. Part of that reason, part of the problem is this scatter graph that they tend to use. They tend to use a scatter graph when they compare different countries, and they put all the countries as a dot, and then they put a line through it. And I could show you what that looks like in comparison. This is a scatter graph. This is the kind of thing that you will see very commonly in these discussions about population and the comparison of different countries. So each of these dots represents a different country, and this line is the kind of line that they use to show the direction that they're going in. And what I decided when I got into this is I realized this scatter graph is really, really, really giving us misinformation. There's no reason why we should use a scatter graph rather than a regular line graph, because a line graph shows you clearly that there is a lot of disparity, that some of those lines do go up and down a lot. And I don't believe we should ignore that. I think that those up and down lines are extremely important to take into account. So this is the kind of graph that they might look at to show you the correlation between the crude birth rate over here, which I have done by 100, and the level of secondary education of females. And this is to show you sort of what this correlation looks like. And I'm using this as a line graph. Now, this is the kind of graph that I've been using on the other hand. So it's not really an XY graph like the other ones. You see the Y area here are just a bunch of different countries. I just found this a lot easier to make this correlation. That's just me. We're really used to seeing the XY graph as a scatter graph. I sort of get it, but I feel like maybe it's just this way of like mapping things out in a linear way to really see the up and down, to really see the order of things that made me want to use this type of graph so that we can see that this is aligned with each country. This here is the crude birth rate. This time I have it by 1,000. And this is some secondary education female. So the same data as the other graphs that I just showed, but this is showing it in a more linear way so that we're comparing it with this line, the secondary education from lowest to highest. You know, and they create this scatter graph with a straight line through it, and the straight line doesn't represent anything. Because if you put that line graph in and then you realize actually it's a curve that we're seeing. It's a curve and it's not a straight line, which means the education of women is not directly correlated to the number of births that she has. This is from Nature magazine in their scientific reports. This came out in 2024. And this is a good example of what I've been saying about what the scatter graph is, what it looks like. I'll just bring your attention to the total fertility rate up here. So this is a comparison of the years of schooling, and this is similar to what I've gone over. And these ones show primary, secondary, and tertiary education. But this one is specifically the TFR, which shows pretty closely what I've been saying. So my complaint about the scatter graph is that they take a graph like this, and then they draw the straight line through it. But if you really look at it, you can see that it's doing this S-curve like this. And, I think a lot of the issues, the more that I get into this birth rate analysis, is that we tend to take a specific age. And this is another big problem. Because the biggest increase in birth rates is happening right now in people of older ages, and because also people of older ages are more likely to have masters and PhDs, it really gives you a false impression of what's going on. So this chart is from a study called Women's Fertility and Educational Level in France, Evidence from the Annual Census Surveys, and this was released in 2010 in Population Volume 65. Now, this shows the total fertility rate of women in France from 2000 to 2008. And this line here is no qualifications. So that's very higher than the others, and it actually went up. And this one here is lower secondary, which you can see went down a little bit. And this gray line here is upper secondary, so that's the next level of education. You can see that hasn't really gone up or down that much. And then we have higher education, and this is the lowest one. But look what's happening here, and this is kind of what I want to talk about, is this is showing a shift. This is a demographic shift. It's hard to tell from this chart whether this is going to continue or not. You can see these two lines converging here. So this is upper secondary and higher education. And higher education has gone up from this time period. So this is showing that there was an increase in this lower level, increase in the higher level, but then a little bit of decrease here. So it's not totally clear what's happening, but this, I believe, is a demographic shift that's happening right on the edge of this year. So even though this is a millennium, I tend to refer to this as the post-millennial demographic shift. And this is just showing where that happened and when that happened. So this chart is from the same study from France, all the same information. And this is just showing what the age-specific fertility rates are. So this is the age here, 15 to 49. And this is the fertility rate here. So you can see just how high these numbers get. This is higher education, right? This is the one that I wanted to look at. So even though this number is very high compared to these other numbers, this one's upper secondary in gray, this is lower secondary. So you see that these numbers are increasing, but this is also smaller, which is why those other fertility rates did look lower. But I'm showing this to see the shift that's happened, right? And this is in 2008, so this is the last year that they showed, which is when we could see that the upper secondary and higher education were around the same. And so this is showing higher, and this is because this is a higher age, which means that, and this might seem kind of obvious, but women in higher education are having children later. So the height of their fertility rate would be higher than these other two. So they're waiting longer to have children. And this no qualifications, so basically under high school, this group has children the soonest, and it's the only one that's higher than this one here. So that just gives you a sense of sort of how this is changing and when women have children. according to when they're getting their education. And obviously, higher education is also correlated to a higher age as well. So this is showing that shift that I was talking about, as more women of higher education have more children. So this here is a graph that I made from a chart taken from the same study that we just went over from France from 2010. So I find this one interesting because it's showing just the shift that I have been talking about, but it's really at the end of this that we see it happening the most. So now these education levels are no qualification, lower, upper secondary, and then higher education here. And this shows pretty clearly this ascent. Now, this is the first order fertility rate, so these are not total fertility rates. This has to do with the first child. So, the number of women having their first child in these categories or these different education levels. And you can see very clearly the lowest no qualification and even these secondary levels have come down a lot, right? They've come right down. And the only one increasing is higher education. And it was quite stable back in the early 2000s. And then you see 2004, 2005, it starts to come up quite a bit and ends up being quite a bit higher. And similar to these other graphs that we've looked at, by the end here, these numbers are all looking a lot more similar and actually surpassed. Look at that. The higher education has surpassed all of these other groups by 2008. And down here, there was a very, very clear distinction between these. So definitely showing the same demographic shift again. So this is from Pew Research Center in the United States. And this shows really clearly this demographic shift right here. So this is the number of women with no children, and it's a comparison between 1992 to 94, and skip ahead till 2006 to 2008. And so this is just showing the percentage of women ages 40 to 44 who don't have children. And as you can see, the old demographics are very clear in the 90s. That's this light green line, less than no high school, college, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And you can see that the childlessness goes up pretty directly with the level of education. And the 2006 to 8 shows very clearly the new demographic. And we see that the bachelor's and master's are almost the same. There was a 7% difference back in the 90s. Now there's only 1% difference. And we're seeing this PhD level go back down. So we're seeing a big increase at the top level of education, which is exactly what we're expecting with this demographic shift that's going on. So here's an update, another article from Pew Research by Gretchen Livingston, same one who worked on the other article. This is 2015, 5 years later. And this here is a comparison from 1992 to 94. This one is even later than the last comparison. So this is 2012 to 14. And this is showing that women with a postgraduate degree, so masters or PhDs from 40 to 44, is showing the change in that time period. So childless women has gone down by a lot, by 8%. The one with one child has gone down a little bit, and we've seen an increase in women with 2 children and a big increase of 6% of women with over 3 children. Right, so this is showing very clearly the changes that have happened in the post-millennial age, so from the 90s to the 2000s, like I was saying. And this is already 10 years ago. So this chart, as you can see, is taken from National Vital Statistics reports from the United States. This is for the year 2019. And this is showing the total fertility rate by educational attainment. And this one is really, really, really clear about what it's showing. This is very clearly the exact J curve that we've been talking about. So you can see this is the levels of education, under high school, some college, associate's degree, and here we have the lowest, bachelor's degree. So you can see how if you're only looking at bachelor's degree, all you would see is this, right? You would just see that this is going down. So bachelor's degree is the lowest, and then we go up by quite a bit. Now this is even higher than associate's degree, master's degree, and then finally the doctorate or PhD level up here. So it's significant. And not only that, but in general, these ones have actually come down by a fair amount. So it's very important to take that into account. So this is from Statistics Austria, and I've just taken their table and turned it into a graph here. And this is from a paper showing education shows strong correlation with life expectancy and fertility. That came out in 2023. This is showing the numbers from 2015 to 2021. So this really shows the shift that I've been talking about. Now, this is their division of education. So we've got compulsory school is this blue line here. We've got apprenticeship here, intermediate vocational school. Here is higher school with Matura exam, A-level, and this is university program. So sort of the range between sort of secondary and early tertiary. So we're not seeing the higher level courses, but that's okay. It still shows us kind of what I've been talking about. So you can see how much higher the compulsory school, so that's just basic schooling, how much higher the total fertility rate is for those. And you can see that here it's 2, it goes up and it goes down quite a bit. So the fact that it's going down is very significant because you look at these other numbers and apprentice and vocational school seem to be pretty neck and neck. They're pretty similar here. You could probably argue there's similar levels of education. They're both about education that's designed directly to take you into work. And you can see them going up here a little bit, and then they've kind of stabilized. There's a bit of up and down. Remember, 2020 and 21 were affected by the pandemic. And over here, this is the higher school. I'm not exactly sure how that would relate to other countries, but you can see that this is the lowest birth rate by far. And not only was low, but it's come up. And it's pretty stable. So that's kind of showing that this extreme here has changed. So even these higher level educations that were lower, I mean, it is showing kind of the opposite, or at least a stabilization compared to this other number that's come down. Now, there is a big obstacle to even looking at this issue, and that's the fact that not all countries release information about their education. And oftentimes they release it after a period of years, for some 5 years, 10 years, and so on. They all have a different method of releasing their statistics to the public about education. It's not necessarily a yearly calculation like a lot of other statistics. So this does make it hard for a intercountry comparison. If you look it up on Wikipedia, the level of education, you'll see that the years that they use are all, so I think some of them are all the way back to like the early 2000s, something like over 20 years difference in when they have released data about educational attendance and attainment. So it's not that easy to look at, right? So again, that kind of makes you wonder, like, why would they be relying on this statistic that isn't even very stable or easy to even analyze? I thought it would be easier to look this up, and it was a bit of a challenge. So most of the international country comparisons that you'll find, number one, they won't include all of the countries, and number two, they will often include a period of either 5 to 10 years to make up for the fact that not every country is releasing its data at the same time. So I looked at two data sets, one from basically 2010 to 15 and another from 2015 to 19. Okay, so here we have the statistics from 2010 to 2015. So these numbers are from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the UIS. So just another division of the United Nations. And this is 2010 to 15. So I've broken this down into 10 percentiles just to look at it easier, so you can see the difference in comparison to the scatter graphs, also comparison to the line graphs. It sort of lumps these different groups together. So basically, this is lower and upper. The blue line is lower education. The orange line is upper education, and this is for women. And this is 0 to 10% education. This is the crude birth rate here by 1,000. And this is all the way up to 90 to 100%. So you can see that this pattern is kind of repeating where this end is a lot clearer than this end. It does tend to even out at the bottom here. The upper secondary is showing a little more extreme, so even higher crude birth rate at the bottom, and then it comes down more and it comes up again in a little more of that J curve, which is kind of what we would expect. 2010 to 15 is kind of where this shift is sort of happening. The other thing is male education, and this is the thing that really kind of blew me away too, is that there's very little difference in this comparison between birth rates and male education. Yet nobody ever claims that it's men who aren't educated enough in order to bring down their birth rate. So why is that? I mean, why have we left men out of the equation again? So many times I'm seeing that they just pretend that men don't exist when they're essential in order to reproduce. And what I've seen too, when you look at education and the different education levels, when the whole population is not very educated, usually men have slightly higher education, even though it's all lower for everyone. Then when you start moving up in the middle ranges of education, then it gets really interesting. Because here you see disparity going in the other direction. And you'll actually see a lot of countries where women have more education than men, higher education. And the higher that you get into education, again, tertiary education, so into those degree levels, then you're seeing an even higher likelihood that women are more educated than men. The higher the education, the more likely women are going to be involved in that more than men. Or the other way around. The fact is, in that middle range of education, it's kind of all over the place. When I was looking at those tertiary numbers, and I'll show that, you'll see that it's almost equal, that there are almost as many countries where women have more education than men when you get to the highest levels. Now, the highest level, so those countries that have the highest level of secondary education, they're virtually all very similar between men and women. When you're getting up to above 95% of the population that has been to high school, you're going to see very, very similar numbers between men and women. So the most educated countries educate both men and women equally. So this chart is basically a breakdown of some of the other same information from the 2010 to 15 education levels, and this is the tertiary only group. And so what I've done is I've broken down the total education levels by 20 percentage points. So at the bottom, we've got up to 20% education for the total population, which is this group here. And I've also broken it down into the groups where the male or the female is higher. So male tertiary education is the dark green one. The light blue is female tertiary education. So you can see at the lowest education, we've got women higher than men, we've got equal, and then we've got men higher than women. And these are the averages from these groups. So you can see even already like these averages aren't quite exactly the same. And like I've been saying, pretty much every time you see the bottom level education, it's usually that men are higher than women. To get a little bit higher than the women are higher than men, and it's all under 20%. So these are the crude birth rates, and you can see the highest birth rates of all of these are in this lowest education with males higher than females. So it's pretty much consistent at the bottom end, but then we go to the top end. So this is education level from 40 to 62%, just because 62 was the highest number. And interestingly enough, there were no groups here that had equal male and female. Instead, we've got women higher from 1 to 10%, and we've got men higher from 1 to 10%. You can see these here. And the males being higher leads to a slightly higher crude birth rate. This one is still fairly high, right? This is not at all the lowest birth rate, which is what you would expect if we were looking at a direct correlation. If women's education was the most important factor in birth rates, then this particular number with women at the highest would be the lowest birth rate, but it's not. So this number is the lowest birth rate, and this is showing a mid-range in the education. So 20 to 40% of the total population educated, and with men significantly higher. Look at how much higher that is than the women. So that's 10 to 20% more. What's also interesting about these numbers is we've got this whole section in here is 20 to 40% education, right? So this whole section, and this one is equal education, right? So you see these numbers are the same. This number is the highest of all these groups, which we would not expect. And then we've seen now that the women are higher here. This is women 10 to 20% higher in the educational level 20 to 40. So what we're seeing is all of these groups are represented, but there's no equal group here. But we've got, in this middle range, a lot of countries with significantly higher women than men that are educated at the tertiary level. Even in the lower education levels in the tertiary education, we're seeing that some of them have women that are higher than men. Now, as I've shown you, even in this middle range, the crude birth rate is at its lowest when men have a significantly higher education. And then we're looking up here, this is a little bit higher. Highest at equal, the highest level of education difference between men and women of all of these, we're still seeing that this crude birth rate is slightly higher than women are a little bit less higher educated. So again, this is just showing that it's not a direct correlation, and it's also showing how high women's education is in some countries, even at the tertiary level. So here I'm showing the actual numbers of different countries because, it's good to just see what this chart actually looks like, where the correlations are coming from. I like to break it down into pieces because then that kind of gives you a better sense of what's going on overall. But it's good to see what this kind of chart looks like, where the whole idea of the birth rate and the education level of education. So this is average education of secondary and tertiary. So I've averaged lower secondary, upper secondary, and tertiary into one average. And it's interesting too because you can see here where the highest numbers are over here, and yet these are really high birth rates. Now we look at the lower end, you would imagine if this was a direct correlation, we'd be seeing the highest numbers down here, and yet we don't. And I wanted to show you this too, to show the difference between male and female education. They're not actually that different. So why would we be connecting a correlation between female education and the difference in birth rates, when, as you can see, male and female education is actually quite similar? And even in those cases where the female line is higher here in Latvia, it is at the lower end of the birth rates, but it's not the lowest. So it's kind of moving in sections. It's not really moving in a direct correlation, which is what you would expect if there was indeed a direct correlation. And actually what we generally see, and this is kind of goes for most of the numbers that I've looked at, there is a dip in the lower end of the crude birth rate in education. So you see it start a little bit lower and then go up. And we're seeing that too. And not only that, but then it's going up again. And with these highest ones up here. So again, highest education does not necessarily correlate with the lowest birth rate for females or for males. So why do we keep repeating the same thing? I'm not really sure. Okay, so this is 2015 to 19, and this is showing some secondary education, male and female. So I believe this was taken from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs for this set of statistics. So that's 2015 to 19, just to do a comparison. Now this red line is the crude birth rate, which I've averaged from 2015 to 19. And these statistics are all the educational levels from that same time period. The dark blue line is the female education, and the orange line is the male education. So you can see it's pretty similar, but this is showing a very similar pattern where the lowest education almost all has men with a higher education and also with a very high crude birth rate. And then we see in the middle ranges there's quite a bit of change. And you can see pretty clearly here that there is an S-curve. It's going up and down. And there's certain ranges that have a bigger extreme, low and high, and other ranges that are much closer together. There is a bit of a dip down at this end as it goes up and down. And this is, again, some secondary education. So basically people who have attended high school, which for some countries is all the way up to 100. So again, yes, there's a correlation, but it's not a strong correlation. And there isn't that much difference between the male and female education when you look at the comparison to the birth rates. When the population increases, it's all of the different classes that increase. And this upper class lifestyle has increased. So the women making a lot of money, and even this is the thing too, for those women who do continue to work, who do make a lot of money, who do have a lot of degrees, will have more children than average because they will be paying another woman to look after her children. And today, of course, now it's not just looking after the children, now it's also giving birth to the child as well through surrogacy. So we're seeing the outsourcing of birth and childcare to lower class women. So the upper class women have just joined men in their lifestyle of quote unquote having it all, meaning having a big career and having a lot of children. So the people with big careers and big incomes and high education are increasing their birth rates by a lot. And this is happening consciously. This is part of a huge philosophy, pronatalism, and a lot of famous people are a part of this. Celebrities form a very, very big part of this pronatalist propaganda machine that's encouraging people to have more and more children, especially those people that can afford it. So if you come back to the previous demographics where you see women with 1 degree with the lowest birth rates, I think what's happening is that as women get educated, they understand contraception better, but it doesn't make them not want kids. The fact is a lot of educated and non-educated women want kids but can't afford them or don't have a partner that they feel they can do that with. And with men too, especially when you're looking at men with a lot of money, they are also more likely to have children because, again, they can afford it. So we're really not seeing this idea that educated women are not having children, and especially not that they don't want children. The most confusing thing for me is that a lot of the ideas about this claim that educated women have less children comes from academia, when it's in academia itself where those women are who are doing the opposite of what they say they're doing. And that confuses me the most. And this is what I wonder about women in that position is, are you aware that people are saying that the most educated women don't have as many children, and yet you have 5? I really wonder what those women think. I haven't heard much about it because I think they're just overpopulation denialists, which comes back to the solution to overpopulation, I believe, needs to be direct education about overpopulation. So the fact is that it's not true. Higher education does not lead to a lower birth rate. The other thing that I think that where this correlation came from is that it's actually the reverse. That actually the cause is the lowered birth rate, and the consequence is higher education. So it's not that higher education leads to a lower birth rate, but rather that a lower birth rate leads to higher education because a woman or a teenager who doesn't have children is more likely to go to school and finish school. It's really that simple. And I did look at that a little bit closer, and you can see a pretty strong correlation between adolescent birth rate and education. So here we've got a comparison of the adolescent birth rate by female secondary education and crude birth rate. Now this is the lower end here for the adolescent birth rate. Now, as you can see here, this is all crude birth rate is by 1,000, which is this orange line here. You can see it's pretty directly correlated to the adolescent birth rate. Now, what's interesting is that this does correlate too with the female population with at least some secondary education. Not as directly, it's a little bit up and down, but overall you can see that there is a relationship between these two, because if an adolescent girl isn't pregnant, she's more likely to be at school. It isn't a higher education that leads women to have less children. And this chart roughly shows something like that. And this is why I am doing this talk, because it's very, very easy for us human beings to get information on our own behavior collectively wrong. And this is, I think, showing a little bit at least of what I'm saying. And of course, it's never that simple. The higher the level of adolescent birth rates, the less likely that population is to be educated. So it's the teenage girls that are getting taken out of school for getting pregnant, or who are getting married off and taken out of school. Like, that's what's going on, is that they are intentionally leaving school in order to get married and have children. That's what's happening. So the education isn't a magical phenomenon that leads women to not want children. That's not what's going on. And the sad thing is that if you did enough interviews and talked to people, you'd be able to figure that out. Now, the phenomenon that I'm talking about, rich, educated women having more children, has been really well documented, and I think this is what's so frustrating. So if you just look this up, you just Google it, like I counted almost 20 different articles that discuss this issue. So it comes into play both with high income. In fact, I think with high income, it's even more pronounced. And I think that's when you see the issue with celebrities, especially celebrities using IVF and surrogacy, because they're bypassing nature's obstacle of preventing overpopulation and forcing it. And the general attitude of the obsession with children that's being touted amongst a lot of powerful people. And actually, I think antinatalists and overpopulation activists are the most helpful for children, because there's no possible way to actually take care of large numbers of children, even if you have a lot of money. And if you have a lot of money, you're in those power circles. You're just giving access to people who want to take advantage of children, and just making it easier for that to happen. So the rich aspect of things is extremely obvious. The rich people are having more children. And then also because education and income are often correlated, either because higher education leads to higher income, or higher income leads to higher education. In both of those situations, we're also seeing that the higher birth rate. in both men and women. So we see this happening really, really openly and really, really obviously in the media. And I think the reason why this keeps getting ignored is because there is an idea that overpopulation is only a problem in the so-called third world, only in Africa and only in parts of Asia and maybe in parts of Central America. So there's a huge, huge focus on dealing with that problem there, where they do have higher birth rates. However, when you get into environmentalism, what you see is, of course, there's this argument that keeps going back and forth between who's the highest reproducer and who's the highest consumer. And so they'll often say, well, oh yeah, well, the third world, they are having more children, but they also have a much lower footprint because they're not making as much money. So it doesn't matter as much. But what that means is that you think it's fine that they're poor and you think it's fine that they're going to die young when they have so many children. You're not seeing celebrities. You're not seeing the Kardashians or, these famous high level people with 7 children, but they are the ones that are both reproducing the most and consuming the most. So they're causing by far more problems and more environmental problems than the people in the third world. And not only that, but a lot of people follow celebrities and they look up to them and they see them as role models and they try to imitate them because they see them as the trendsetters. So if all the celebrities are doing IVF and surrogacy to have a large number of children, then regular people will follow along and try to do the same thing. And that's causing so many problems. So my hope is that people will just stop repeating the lie that higher educated women naturally have less children, because it's simply not true. It comes from statistics that weren't thought through enough, partially because of looking at lower levels of education and also partly at looking at only certain age groups. And that comes down to the fertility rate problem again, which I went over in my last video. So using the total fertility rate, which only measures women, looking at women's education, again, only looking at women. This is a big, big problem. Women do not have children alone. They require a man to have children, and I think it's high time that men are included in the responsibility for why there are so many children. And I think we need to just understand that and also increase overpopulation education, increase ecology education in those lower levels of education all the way up until university. It's really sad to see how much brainwashing and how much censorship has happened. I know that overpopulation is a censored issue, that people are shutting down this discussion on purpose. And that's a totally anti-intellectual stance. It's totally anti-educational. And I worry about what kind of education people are actually getting that's shutting down their ability to understand that we are going to face really, really serious problems if we don't get that population to come down. And educating women in general education or even in higher level education simply hasn't worked. It's not working, and the situation is getting worse. Everywhere that I've looked at, that I've read about this, France, Australia, different parts of Africa, Canada, United States, and all of these places, the highest level of income and education in women these are exactly the people that are having the most children, and they have control over that. So we cannot trust this group of people to be the ones to solve the problem, that they're in fact increasing the problem. So this is a major, major issue. And I think we need to really look at it and take it seriously. There are enough people that have understood it that we need to get this common knowledge out there. Educating women isn't the way to solve overpopulation. However, education equality is the key to a better quality of life for everyone. And stop making this a women's only problem, because it is not a women's only problem. And stop making it a third world problem, because this is not a third world only problem either. War doesn't happen in an underpopulated planet. It doesn't. There's no need for war when there's not very many people. Only an overpopulated humanity will lead to war. And I believe that's why this war is happening. And the more that people are having children right now, the more it's going to get worse. Because a birth war will lead to a real war, and there's no reason to think that your children are going to follow your politics. That's not how you spread good politics, is by having kids. That's a dictatorship, control freak mentality that I think is really toxic. So thanks for joining me on this subject. I'm going to keep going through a number of other issues. I do want to still deal with some of the other statistics on gender because there's more to say about it, especially when you get into government and labor, especially, and also the difference between men and women. I went over what's happening with women mostly, but the fact is that the differences between genders do say a lot about a society, and they do make a big difference when it comes to how many kids are being born. So thank you very much. This is Kim Anderson, and I'll be back with another video in a little while. Thank you.